I flow from the source.
Welcome to Global Justice Ecology Project's Resistance and Action, where we report and reflect on the front lines of today's pressing struggles. I'm your host, Ruddy Turnstone. This is number 1 in our series, so to get an idea of what lies ahead, we will report on recent news, jump into our GE Trees Minute, and head into our interview with Julia, who shares with us how communities, not institutions, helped each other survive in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, and what work is still needed today. Keep an eye out for future episodes where guests will speak on Indigenous issues, Black liberation and its intersections with the extraction industry, and other critical topics. On to the news.
On Friday, August 17th, the United Nations Human Rights Committee determined that incarcerated former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, also known as Lula, should be able to run in Brazil's presidential elections coming up in October, as his cases and corruption have not been finalized. Lula is the beloved candidate of many social movements in Brazil, and from behind bars is polling way ahead of any of his political contenders. He has been incarcerated since April, and according to Al Jazeera, he says it is to prevent him from running for president. Called for by Via Campesina, militants of several social movements, including the landless workers movement, have been on hunger strike in Brazil since July 31st, demanding that Lula be released and protesting the rising poverty rates. The Supreme Federal Court has till September 17th to determine whether Lula can run for president. After 12 years of being on the run, Green Scare defendant Joseph Dibby was arrested in Cuba. He is alleged to have participated in many Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front acts of liberation and sabotage. According to a press release from the Civil Liberties Defense Center, from 1995 to 2001, the ELF and ALF caused more than $45 million in damages to horse slaughterhouses and federal horse capture facilities, old-growth timber companies, and a ski resort encroaching on Canadian lynx habitat. Dibby faces charges in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington. Slavery never ended. That is one of the slogans of this year's prison strikes happening in conjunction with the 47th anniversary of the Attica prisoner uprising. From August 21st to September 9th, prisoners in at least 17 states and internationally are expected to participate in the strikes. Using the momentum of months of massive resistance against Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, solidarity demonstrations will also be happening at various immigration detention centers. Prisoners have released 10 demands. Some are putting an end to prison slavery, ceasing overcharging Black and brown people, improving prison conditions, better education access, allowing prisoners to vote, and more basic human rights needs. To stay updated on the strikes and see if there is an event planned near you, visit itsgoingdown.org. The European Court of Justice released a decision on July 25th, which will require any organisms, including trees, engineered with CRISPR, TALEN, or other new gene editing technologies, to be identified as genetically modified organisms, and therefore subject to the European Union's GMO directive. This comes at a time when the push for commercializing genetically engineered trees is at full throttle. Brazil's Futura gene received approval for its GE eucalyptus in 2015 and is currently developing them for commercial release. The United States Department of Agriculture is writing a final environmental impact statement on ArborGen's GE eucalyptus, and a final EIS on Southern Garden Citrus Nursery's application for the distribution of a GE virus into more than 500,000 acres of citrus orchards throughout the state of Florida. And a petition to deregulate a GE American chestnut for the release directly into wild forest is expected soon. The USDA responded to the ECJ's decision with dismay. The commercialization of these technologies globally will increase the occurrence of trade disruptions within the EU. Government-funded projects such as the Center for Bioenergy Innovation may be impacted. The CBI is a part of the Department of Energy's Oak Ridge National Laboratory and is consistently conducting research on poplars for the biofuel industry. Through genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and other techniques, they are attempting to reduce the lignin in poplars so they more easily break down during biofuel processing. The ECJ decision will force regulation of GE poplar seedlings and impact attempts to sell and propagate them in the EU. This decision comes on the heels of newly published research that demonstrates the unintended and dangerous consequences CRISPR editing can have. An article in The Hindu explained that studies from Novartis and the Karolinska Institute have documented that the CRISPR-Cas9 system can impair a protein called p53, which helps maintain cell health and prevent them from turning cancerous. In addition, when the p53 protein is not damaged after editing, the protein often goes and undoes the work of the CRISPR-Cas9 system. Another study found that cells suffered from large, unintended DNA deletions after the CRISPR editing. Thorough studies of these new technologies shows that even in the lab, unintended and dangerous consequences have been overlooked. These new studies demonstrate the critical need to fully review genomes after editing and proves that the rush to implement gene editing technologies and the push not to regulate is deeply reckless.
So many reasons why we should rise up. Reach one and teach one. Excuses help no one. Reach one and teach one. We gotta rise up.
For all my teachers facing uphill battles, opposing the structure imposed to make us cattle, for daring to teach.
We launched this series around the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Harvey hitting landfall in the Gulf South. Although the interview reflects on 6 months after it hit, many of the issues touched upon still impact people today. The Kaiser Family Foundation conducted a survey and found that 3 out of 10 people that were impacted are still affected in the midst of another hurricane season. So let's hear from Julia about the aftermath of the hurricane, the on-the-ground work they did, and how communities helped each other when institutional actions cost people their lives and safety.
People should never give up. So many reasons why we should rise up. Reach one and teach
Yeah, I'm Julia. I use they, and I'm going to talk about World on My Shoulders, which is my org.
All right. Tell me more.
I'll start pre-storm. So when the weather warning started, we began trying to get the prisons evacuated. Just as a process, we were doing the phone blast, mostly through our local ABC. And then other people started rescuing immediately. The state was not going and picking people up from their houses. There were people that went out in their kayaks and that type of thing. And so a crew did that a lot, and that's West Street Recovery. They're still also working a lot there. Then several other people got together and worked just like as a solidarity thing within Houston. But my org, World on My Shoulders, worked with Black Women's Defense League specifically, and we went out together to town as soon as the roads were passable because we were from North and East Texas, so a little bit further up from the storm, so we had to actually be able to go through the roads before we could come into town and help relieve some of the organizers whose houses were flooding as they were actively trying to get other people out of their houses. We started mostly with figuring out what the needs were, so a lot of it was trying to find the shelters that were being exposed on the news. Like, people were saying, this is, if there's an emergency, your house is flooding, come to this shelter. And there was a parent and child that died at the gates of one of those shelters because they had not actually opened them. They were blasting on the news saying, if the water's rising in your house, please come here. But some of those places weren't actually open, and if you got there, you were stuck. So there were actual fatalities, and there were a lot of other people who just, like, not even fatalities, but other calamities, like they drove their car out of the house to go to the shelter, and they ruined their car, and then the shelter didn't exist. So once we started assessing those types of needs, we started going into the places that did exist that were open for Red Cross shelters and giving out, working with our Food Not Bombs, giving out food in front of the shelter doors and just staying there and kind of surveying to figure out what was going on, because we got a lot of reports back from people. I was homeless in town too, so I was actively engaged with the community that I'm helping. So we would find out that ICE was around, or that people were getting kicked out, or that there were robberies and preferential treatment, and a lot of cops bullying people because town was under curfew for weeks and weeks. I don't even know how many weeks exactly, honestly, but it was under curfew for a while, and so they could do whatever they wanted to you between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning. So once we started assessing those needs, we started figuring out what the next steps were going to be. So that's when we started with the grief counseling, the rebuilding the houses, the relocating the families because of the environmental concerns. some of the families that we dealt with had children who had not had skin issues or hygiene related anything, and then immediately post-storm started breaking out in festering rashes. And most of the families used Medicaid, so when they would go into the clinics, they would tell them that it was fine, it was just maybe pre-eczema, don't worry about this, that, or the other, and it has nothing to do with the storm. So we started getting frustrated with what we couldn't do as far as our herbalist skills, and what we couldn't even fully assess at that point, and relocated families. And so when we started relocating families, we found out that those kids' rashes were clearing up almost immediately, and realized that we'd have to start working on the environmental angles a lot sooner than we had prepared for. Ideally, I would have liked to work on healing people personally for a lot of months before we started having to deal with the environmental effects as far as the dirty soil and that type of stuff, but we got slammed with both at the same time. So once we were into relief mode, there's a crew called West Street Recovery, and they're still rebuilding houses, but once we got into relief mode and everyone kind of went back to the things that they know their skills at more, I focused on running free stores, grief counseling, doing doula work, and trying to make sure that the families who have incarcerated parents were supported. As it looks now, it's about 6 months later, and for the most part, we're just doing what we are asked to do. We have made a lot of points of contact, so as people come to us, we come up with other things. So we're working on a lot of preserving. I teach people canning and sprouting, and if you have food stamp cards, how to use those things to be able to get yourself out into at least some sort of level of sufficiency, because when those food stamp cuts hit, they hit you pretty hard as a family. So I just try to teach you how to stretch what you have when you have it, because you don't know if it's going to last or not. So we work on a lot of gardening angles and then doing the food not bombs type of stuff. But also someone I closely work with has a food forest project, and they go in and ask people, how many people live in your family? Can we dig right here? And you got a 3-person family, they'll make enough food for 6 people, and then that's half the food that you can take out for food not bombs later on. So we're working on that angle, working on a lot of child care, doula type of stuff. And then the counseling has led us to new projects. So we also shelter people alongside running an info shop, an art gallery.
Regarding sheltering people, you mentioned that some of the shelters were not open to the public or did not exist. Was there actions taken at those shelters in terms of getting people inside the shelters when they were refusing people? What did that look like?
Well, with the shelters that were actually open, under curfew at midnight, the Red Cross shelter said that you couldn't go in anymore. So it's 12:01, you can't walk in the door. But their point of entrance was not accessible for anyone who wasn't able to actually just take off and sprint at some point. It was several city blocks long, and there was only one entrance you could go in if you were a general person. There was one entrance you could go in if you were a person with pets. And so you had to make it somewhere along that square of the building and be inside of it by midnight. And even if you knew time was getting close, there's still not like a tangible way to get down that whole block at once. So they would see people and close the doors on them. So we started physically opening the doors and pushing people in and telling them that that wasn't an option, which didn't exactly make the police happy, because the way that this scenario looks like, imagine parallel lines. There's one line where there's a door and they're telling you can't go in because it's 12:01. There's a sidewalk where you're standing on, and then on the other side of that are the police telling you it's 12:01, it's after curfew, so go ahead and just get in this car that we have parked right here. So we made sure to make our presence pretty heavy as far as showing up at the doors of their shelters that were open. But when I was talking earlier about the fatality, that happened because the shelter doors never opened. They put on the news that the place existed. They ended up releasing a statement later and saying that the reason that the mother and child had died was because of their own error, because they did not realize that it was the north versus east gate or some sort of stuff like that. But when we came into town, we physically went to the doors of that place, and it was bolted, chained, and locked, and never been opened or used. And we went back there several times, and it never was in use as a shelter. But they said that it was in use that day as a shelter, and that those people just went to the wrong gate and drowned at it. So there's a lot of examples of the state just making up some stuff as far as it goes with relief. A lot of their campaigns started as a direct response, it felt like, from being embarrassed by things that we were doing and asking them. We were showing up at any time that we could find some of those cities' officials and asking them why they weren't present where we were and what they would do to help. And it was not mostly our actions, it was led by the communities themselves who were affected by this, and they wanted to honestly know why the mayor was doing a presentation about how much this town had helped each other, when what had really helped them was mostly autonomous networks of people that had loosely worked together before. All the stuff with the Houston disaster relief and the Houston response units honestly was not in place before this. I just want people to fully realize that this is a direct reaction to people who had already made connections with each other, and when we were faced with a situation, everyone actually called in a friend at that moment, and then called in a friend of a friend, and then brought people from other places. A lot of the people that came and helped us rebuild the first couple months only came for 4 or 5 days in a row, but they worked that whole entire time, all of those 4 or 5 days, and took care of hundreds of people, and then went back to wherever they had their obligations to. It was not city or state led. They were invisible. When the Red Cross finally did show up in some of the neighborhoods we work in, they were actually tangibly kicked out. Like, when they came in with their mobile response, they have like mini buses that they go around in. And so the first one I came across went into a Spanish-speaking neighborhood with cups of elotes, but they were like not even real to begin with. But also the people that were closest to there was a shelter that I found them because I was dropping off supplies to a shelter that was afraid to use the state because they know how it works when you actually do that, and they had so many undocumented children inside there. And so we're dropping off food and like all the stuff that we've done, and then the Red Cross shows up for the first time, and they're just trying to hand out cups of elotes and like tokenize the entire neighborhood that they're standing in. And they got kicked out of there. The people told them just turn around now. But then in another neighborhood we worked in, the first time that the Red Cross actually came through, they were kicked out a little differently. Their vehicles got tagged up with a lot of stuff, and they let them know that they weren't going to be welcome to keep running through there. So we saw like the community immediate response to who was doing work and who was not, and how it looked like. And so a lot of the advocacy that I've done personally has been shaped by that. And like, if someone asks me to do something, I'll do it. So I might do court advocacy, I might go holler at somebody's city official, I might end up sheltering people, or I might figure out different ways of other stuff you can't exactly talk about to make sure those families don't have those same problems anymore, you know?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that both kids and families and people were getting these rashes. Do you know either which chemicals or which corporations could have or were responsible for these damaging effects to people's skin during post-hurricane?
Well, a lot of the kids that had the rashes that were festering lived in a place, if they didn't live there, they lived in one of the neighborhoods very close to there. But there's an area called Manchester, and we have like a toxic tour that goes through there. There's refineries just in the middle of town. Houston doesn't have a lot of zoning regulations, so there were families that were living in like low-income housing that lived immediately beside where those factories were, where it's most of the cases of families that we relocated. So, like, tangibly we know that it's related to something of what they're putting out there through the Port of Houston, but we can't exactly pinpoint it well enough to know which one of the factories is responsible for it or which one of them it is. But it's a whole concentrated area, like right around the Port of Houston. Manchester is where all that stuff is. What it did seem like was that it was something that was not reactive to cleansing. It was not reactive to salves and ointments, and like just keeping it clean and dry didn't work. Keeping it wrapped with a poultice didn't work. Using over-the-counter creams didn't work. And they just continued to fester no matter how, if you let it get clean, if you let it get dirty, if you let it whatever happen, it just kept getting worse and worse. But when we physically removed the people from the city of Houston is whenever they started improving. We had one people go into Louisiana, and they weren't near New Orleans or any of the pipelines, and their stuff cleared up. And then we had some people go deep up into the Ozarks, and theirs cleared up within like 3 days. But the people that came to Louisiana cleared up within about a week. And then some of the other people went to different climates, but we were watching environmentally like where the families were going to with that kind of stuff. And it seems like if you went somewhere that was a little bit less of a trash can than Houston, that you would end up improving about immediately.
What does it look like 6 months later in terms of what the communities are facing regarding the state and getting services and things like that?
There's been a big push lately. There's a whole program they came up with through FEMA called the PREPs. So the house I live in was flooded up about waist high. And they said that it was 10% damaged, so gave the house enough money to be able to fix one room of it. And so we started going and like taking out complainants and people who were affected like that. And they did enough of pushing of that FEMA invented a new program called PREPs and are going back into the houses. It's been not even 2 weeks since they came back to the same house that they had said was 10% damaged before, and brought it up to code. So we got new electrical boxes, all kinds of air conditioners, like refrigerants or things they do. They rebuild bathrooms, like literally admitting the fault of their mistakes and coming back 6 months later to make it something that they could call livable, because FEMA has already written their name and address down, so they have to say that they fixed it. So now there's a crew that came through 6 months later. But the people, if you didn't fix up your house, then you were subject to having people like Child Protective Services come in your house and say that you were neglecting them because it wasn't a livable arrangement. But if you did update it, they don't give you money back. We had people come from across the country and help us rebuild our stuff, and not only, but others too. And all the stuff that we did into that house in that interim period since the storm has happened was just out of our pocket. They don't give you anything back for receipts. They don't go through our like say, hey, you did all of this. They just have to do whatever has to be done to get it up to code. So they came back through and we took everything we could get out of them and got all our neighbors to take that stuff too. But these programs are just basically covering up the stuff that we've been telling them for the last few months that they are absolutely not doing. So there's another big thing where they're opening day use centers. Usually the place in town, you know, where you go get the diabetes screening, or where they like do a weight and blood pressure check, like just like a city little building. But they're using them as day use centers now, and so they set them up kind of as disaster relief, and they'll have that PREPS program and the Red Cross and Salvation Army, HHSC, all them types of offices sit around in there all day and let you fill out applications for them there. And then they it's to say that the city's helping the neighborhoods, but there's also nefarious purposes. There's a bike trail that connects a lot of the there's a bike trail that exists. Most of the very gentrified neighborhoods in Houston have, like, you can spot them because there's just like people jogging and walking through the middle of town and like maintain trails and stuff like that. And so there's a loop around town called 610, and ideally the bike trail will be a lesser loop within 610 that connects all the places already gentrified to all of the hoods that they want to finish taking. And I live in one of those. And so what they're proposing is that these day use centers in the state are so successful, so we should just let them come in and hang out in town, whatever they want to do. You know, there's all these places like the mom and pop stops that couldn't reopen because they didn't have money and it basically got pushed out of town. So we just take these empty buildings and go ahead and get rid of them and start building up the little strip mall situation, and then we can just put this other thing here. And they're trying to charter the schools in a way that effectively allows them to still be a part of the Houston ISD, but restricts so much with usage. It's like the prison schools. We already have the KIPP system in town, and so they're trying to propose something, because we still have like fights and interactions and violence between children and, like, I don't know, traumatized people acting traumatized, and they just happen to be young enough to be stuck in the KIPP school. And so they're trying to propose that they should have something a little more stringent.
What is a KIPP school?
A KIPP school is a type of charter school. They have them in several cities. It's not just in Houston, but it's basically a prison school. So when you go there, they do the uniforms, the backpack checks, all that kind of stuff, but they are kind of formatted in a way where you want to send your kid to it, because it's where they get a lot of real world stuff, like a magnet school that helps everything. So if you want to be into performing arts, or if you want to be into science, if you want to be in any type of thing and just give your kid a chance because you can't give them lessons, you really want to throw them in the lottery so they could get a chance to go to the KIPP school. So it's just like a part of the same prison system type stuff. I haven't figured out that connection all the way, but I'm pretty sure that KIPPs and prisons are directly related, because the way that they structure their school system is down to the minute, very exact, and you can get infractions basically for thinking and asking questions.
So 6 months later, is there a disparity between different racialized communities in terms of how they're recovering? Like, are black and brown communities recovering in a different way than predominantly white communities, or how is that playing out?
From what I've seen, I mean, I don't have a lot of connections in those types of neighborhoods, but from what I saw, if you lived in a pretty wealthy neighborhood, you were going to be approved for your FEMA from 50 to 70% versus the 10 to 20% that people in our neighborhoods were. So if they lived in $1 million house, they still got messed around as far as like the value that they got, but they immediately got a check that was enough to take care of that house, or to make up the lesser and sell that house and like do all of that stuff. The people that were paycheck to paycheck were the people that were told that they only had enough that FEMA could give them to fix a room or two. So it's definitely a class barrier. It just happens to also be a race barrier too, because of the way that the caste system is set up in Houston. But black and brown communities, specifically a lot of Asian communities too, were not prioritized at all. So they were allowed to kind of take the neighborhoods. I live in a food desert neighborhood that had quite a few types of fried chicken and like fast food type stuff, you know, quick grab eats. But a lot of the single mothers and people that are elderly and those types of people that live in the low income housing were the same people who worked there. So most of those like trash restaurants don't even exist in my neighborhood now. So our food desert has become more empty than it was even before the storm, which was already pretty empty. So you can't access too much anything, honestly.
While at the same time, other places are being rapidly gentrified post the hurricane.
Yeah, so there's a decent amount of push to where people figure out if these neighborhoods are still, my neighborhood's like 40% abandoned still post-storm right now. And so there's a proposal to take all those neighborhoods and just go ahead and let the developers have them to help beautify the city, and just raise all of these old houses that people just recently got pushed out of, and start building the strip malls and take care of all that. And there's a bike trail that would connect all that. But then outside of how that works, it would also allow for there's two local business economies. You know what I mean? People talk about shopping local. Like, there's definitely these people have been having a restaurant for 50 to 60 years versus these hipsters just opened a thing and put a Houston stamp on it. And so the push is to, like, still, Houston's very liberal, like, politics-wise. Like, there's a black mayor, and they love shopping local, and people support each other is a big tagline, like the Houston Strong type stuff. But then the other half of that is it's not the people who were in Houston. And, like, I'm partially a part of that, you know what I mean? I'm from East Texas and Kentucky, and I'm not, like, a Houstonian. My family hasn't been there generations. I have family that's been there for decades, but I don't have family that's been there for centuries. And it's a lot of the push that I saw happening within cities like Austin about a decade ago, where all the quirkiness kind of gets commodified in a way so that you can push out the people who would maybe be scary to you, but then still keep all their stuff.
What, for people that would be listening to this, do you have suggestions or advice in terms of the type of support that they could either provide or action items that they could do, either for supporting Houston or locally in their areas?
Well, I'd say crew up. Like, really honestly, if you are someone that's involved at any point already within, like, movement type work, to figure out who around you and what their differences are and how important that is to you. Because a big thing that I had to do was call people who I have, like, social issues with and ask them to please help me save people's lives. So to analyze your odds, and, like, I'm working on a conflict resolution zine right now where we prioritize people in our lives, maybe by, like, ABC groups or, like, red, green, yellow. That's why the zine's not done, is because I don't know how it looks. But where we prioritize people in our lives with what we're comfortable with letting them have access to, and how we interact with them and how we work with them, so that crews who don't get along and individuals who don't get along but both have skills that would be complementary to helping the greater community can work with each other and know that system. Like, if I tell you that you're a green to me, you tell me that I'm a yellow to you, then that means we just work like we're yellows together, and you don't have to give me any more than that type of thing. So analyze your crew and your situation and figure out what's petty, what's actual wrong, and if you're into that type of thing, who needs to be pushed out. Because what we found was, like, a lot of the people that there was speculation about, a lot of the people who had a lot of social issues, a lot of the people who have to deal with not holding that personal accountability in settings outside of storm relief, were also the same people who didn't manage to show up during storm relief. So if you keep your scene pretty clean, then it'll help you out when it's time to tighten up. As far as helping us, I live in a shared house, and if you want to come stay on the couch or something, you're more than welcome to show up. Our crew's pretty autonomous. There's a lot of things to do with childcare, music. So as far as sheltering people, part of what we're trying to do is help them get away from the state, obviously, because CPS is messing with them. So when we take them, we always give them the option to homeschool or to do whatever they can to not use those social services. So we help them start their own at-home businesses and that type of thing, so that they can get rid of their food stamp cards and their Medicaid. And we help them, if they want to do that, take their kids out of public schools, because those are the places where CPS will reconnect with you and open a case back up. Because if they've opened one case on you, they will continue to do that as long as they feel like it seems. So if people want to show up, there's a range of things to do. If you can grow stuff, if you can do childcare, if you're generally agreeable, there's errand runners, like rebuilders, physically, laborers, that kind of stuff. Like, literally anything you could do. There's satellite stuff that people could do for us. We need things translated sometimes. We need people to run and help out with our social media campaigns. And then, like, for me personally, World on My Shoulders is my org, and if it doesn't have money in the bank, then I just come up with it and put it in there myself. And a thing that I've noticed is, like, I've not really participated in a lot of dealing with the media, but each time that I do, more people find me and reach out to me for help than people that reach out to me to give me help. So what happened the last time is we had thousands of new requests for services. I did an interview with Democracy Now!, and so people were, like, very congratulatory about it. But we weren't getting any more money in the bank, but we were getting thousands of people that had heard that story and were in situations where they needed help. And so if you could lessen that burden, like, look at the World on My Shoulders site. There's donation links and all that kind of stuff on there. We usually have some sort of campaign going on.
What's the website?
worldomyshoulders.org. And then we got the Facebook, Instagram, and all that kind of stuff too.
This is great. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
That wraps up our first podcast in the series. Till next time, keep resisting, keep rising. Resistance and Action is a program of Global Justice Ecology Project. It is produced by Kip Doyle. Music heard on this podcast is performed by Megascyph. Titles include Splash, Rattletail, and Reach One. To check out more, visit megascyph.com. Links to this podcast and our other projects can be found at globaljusticeecology.org.